views expressed on this program are those of the hosts, guests, and callers, and are not necessarily those of this station, its management, or other advertisers. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio.
Get ready for a game changer. Sarah Westall is bringing you Business Game Changers Radio. Mondays at noon Pacific, 3 Eastern, Sarah will bring you leading experts, visionaries, and newsmakers who provide the best commentary on big issues and cutting-edge innovations. Sarah's 20 years as a business executive will help you think like an entrepreneur with expertise, energy, and attitude. Now here's your host, Sarah Westall.
Welcome to Business Game Changers. I'm Sarah Westall, and you listen to Conscious Business Radio Network on Transformation Talk Radio. Were you aware that the United States has the highest corporate tax rate in the world? In fact, we just surpassed Japan. It's a pretty sad commentary that our taxes are that high. I know people think that corporations need to be taxed higher, but that's because there's loopholes and all sorts of other things in our tax code, not because of the actual rate that corporations are taxed, because the average corporation cannot take advantage of these loopholes and are actually taxed at these high rates. And we are going to be talking about that today. In fact, I have the founder of the Tea Party movement coming on to the show. He's the co-founder. His name is Michael Johns. And whether you hate the Tea Party, you love them, or you're somewhere in between, there is no denying that the Tea Party movement has had a large impact on our country. Their core beliefs, mainly smaller government, less taxes, and balancing the budget, is shared belief by many, including Republicans, independents, and even some Democrats agree with these ideas. It's hard to argue that balancing the budget or balancing any budget is not a fundamentally responsible thing to do. And I don't even know if our country's budget can be balanced at this point. It's a more of a theoretical thing that we can discuss as far as whether you can even balance it anymore. But regardless, managing your money and the budget in a responsible way I don't think people can argue that. And the point of this show is to cover the edge of change. This includes disruption and uncomfortable topics at times that need to be discussed in open, and I try to do that in a respectful manner. And that means that bringing on someone like the co-founder of the Tea Party, when it's had a monumental effect on our culture, fits that category of disruption and change and the big issues. And I bring people from all spectrums of the political, ocean out there and talk about things. And I'm not afraid to tackle issues that are hard, issues that cause disruption and change. And some of this stuff can be, frankly, hard to listen to. And if you don't believe the same things that somebody that's from the Tea Party or someone that's on the far left or far right, whatever, it's important to at least keep an open mind and understand what they're saying. Otherwise, we're not going to make progress in this country. I think the biggest problem is that we have this big notion of racist bigotry and hate going on right now. And I think that often overshadows what's going on, especially with the Tea Party, the insiders, and you'll hear in this interview how much they despise the fact that bigotry is associated with their movement. And they work hard to try to get those people out of their movement, and it is what it is. It destroys their integrity, and they know that. It takes away from their core messages, and basically, in the end, it hurts our country's ability to meaningful debate on very important topics. I mean, after all, why can't you believe in lowering corporate taxes without being labeled a bigot? I don't see how those two issues relate to each other, right? I mean, just because you think that corporate tax, I think if you don't lower corporate taxes, it affects our ability to maintain jobs because corporations are going to go elsewhere, right? But why does that have to do with bigotry? The point is that in our current political system, the people on the right believe in lower taxes, but yet the right is associated with hate and bigotry. So what do you do as a political or as a citizen when you believe in smaller government, or you believe in lowering taxes, you believe in more fiscal responsibility? I don't think Democrats necessarily don't believe in fiscal responsibility, but as far as wanting to really take that on as a need and making a smaller government, that's associated with the right. But then so is hate and bigotry. Well, I just don't see how those two issues should have to correspond with each other. And if we don't separate that, then we're not going to be able to have meaningful discussions on economic issues that are very important, like corporate taxes. If we're the highest in the world in corporate taxes and we're losing jobs, we need to question that. The most socialist countries in the world have lower corporate taxes than we do. So you can't say that it's not, we're going towards socialism and we need to tax corporations. Well, the socialist countries have lower corporate tax. So it's an issue that we need to discuss and figure it out. Maybe what you're really talking about is getting rid of loopholes where corporations are paying 0% or they're getting money from the government, and other smaller business and corporations pay these high percentages. So the issues really should be talking about tax incentives and loopholes, not corporate tax rates. And so we're going to be talking about a lot of that today. And I have, like I said, Michael Johns is coming on, and we're going to be talking about those issues in a blunt and engaging way. And we're going to talk about the Tea Party goals and what he sees and how they're going to affect the current election. He's a pretty impressive guy. He's a healthcare executive, but he was a former White House and U.S. federal government official. And he is a writer, and he's one of the founders of the Tea Party. He's currently the executive director of the Tea Party Community, which is the nation's largest Tea Party social media organization. But he was also a speechwriter for George W. Bush, a senior aide to former New Jersey governor and 9/11 Commission Chairman Tom Klein, and also a senior United States Senate aide to U.S. Senator Olympia Snowe. So he's pretty seasoned in the political arena, so it's pretty fun to have him on. He's been on numerous media numerous media publications and appeared on television, CBS News, PBS, CNBC, C-SPAN, you name it. And now we are going to welcome Michael Johns to the program. Hi, Michael. Welcome to the program.
Hey, it's a pleasure.
So what role have you had in the Tea Party? I know you're one of the co-founders, but can you elaborate on that and then what your role is now?
Yeah, the founding of the Tea Party movement, in my judgment, it's one of the most intriguing political stories of our lifetimes. By we, I mean roughly 20 people from around the country, inspired by what you may recall was the CNBC reporter Rick Santelli's rant from the Mercantile Exchange in Chicago. It threw some emails around, and we decided to do a conference call about it. On that call, we had a great agreement that we wanted to do on tax day, April 15th of 2009, a great number of rallies across the country. And, in our first conversations, I don't think any of us really envisioned that the movement would be this enduring or iconic. It was really, we were hoping that we could have, really one big successful day. And of course, the day was so successful that, and in fact, even leading up to the day, the anticipation of it was so significant that it really has transpired into a movement. In fact, by Gallup and other polls, about 18% of the country considers themselves either very sympathetic with or even involved with the Tea Party movement. So it represents a very sizable segment of the voting population.
Well, I think you came at the right time and tapped into a feeling that's happening across the country. But what is the Tea Party's original goals, and what are they today?
Well, I would say really the driving force within the Tea Party movement, well, first and foremost, is a love of country. I think you would find among all of our founding members, and even among most, of our membership generally, that there is a perception that the United States of America is a country like no other, that we're hugely fortunate to be born and have the opportunity to live and work here, and that there's something special about it. It's the only country, not just in the world presently, but really in the history of the world, that was founded on a set of ideals as opposed to founded out of a military or diplomatic conquest.
Or somebody wanting power.
So I mean, that really wasn't the driving force behind the founding of the country. And I think in the Tea Party movement, there's an acute awareness of that. So that leads in turn to a kind of a second conclusion, which is that because we have something very special here, that something special really needs to be protected. And we've been warned throughout history from the founders onward, as recently as Reagan, that we're only a generation away from losing freedom. And I think there's also a recognition in the Tea Party movement that that's true. And then, of course, once, really kind of at the end of the George W. Bush administration, when there seemed to be a kind of undisciplined growth in the power and reach of government,
yes,
you started to see the national consensus was emerging, even for those of us like myself who voted for George W. Bush enthusiastically, a concern about that. And then it only amplified further with Obama's agenda, which in the perception of most Tea Party members is largely unconstitutional. It's not respectful of the tricameral nature of our government. It seems to have absolute disregard for congressional input or for adherence to the Constitution. And then, of course, the Tea Party, the TEA, was always stood for taxed enough already. Our perception being that at all levels and in all ways, the country's overtaxed. Not just at the higher, marginal rates, as has sometimes been depicted as being our message, but even things like the payroll tax, which affect every working American, are really punitive in nature. They serve to discourage job creation. They drive wages down, and
we're the
they've generally been...
we have the highest tax rate for companies, corporations, businesses in the
world.
world. Yeah, so we
were second for a while after Japan, and we've eclipsed Japan now.
Oh, we've taken over as number one.
So
we're
if you
really
think
good
about
at something.
you think about
no, I shouldn't say
if
that
you think
way.
about how important what you just said is if you were sitting around without any degree of national loyalty, which capital can flow around the world fairly easily these days, why would you start a company in the country with the highest corporate tax rate in the world?
Well,
when you've got other places where not only is the rate lower, but you've got some developed economies where there is no corporate tax rate.
Well, yeah,
and that to me is a no-brainer, and it's a no-brainer like we've seen in the United States too. Because if you look, say, I've spent a good amount of time in Texas, for instance, where there's no state income tax, and that economy is just hugely prospering and growing. Mostly because you get a lot of California-based companies that are, paying a 10% tax, and it's just almost a no-brainer to relocate.
See, the problem is, people who don't understand think that you're just not a patriot. You just don't care about the country. The problem is when it comes to international businesses, they don't even think about that. They're just looking to locate they're just pure business. And yeah, you know what I'm saying? And so it's not smart for us to be doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I've held senior roles in two publicly traded companies, and in which I've interacted with very closely day to day with CEOs of publicly traded companies, and it's almost completely understandable when you understand the fiduciary responsibilities of a company of that size and magnitude and of a global nature.
The CEO will just lose their job if they don't provide.
If they have an opportunity to decrease operational costs, that's an immediate impact on margins and profitability, and that's really the ultimate obligation of a senior executive in any publicly traded company. So it becomes like, I think, and this is why I'm hugely sympathetic with the message that I think Donald Trump's been putting out, is that, yeah, we don't really like the companies that are relocating, but I don't think ultimately, I don't think ultimately they're to blame. I mean, they're almost victimized by this system as well. It's really a government of our own that is presumably accountable to the voting public that has allowed this to happen.
Well, you're pretty much saying that you have to depend on people to pay more to stay here. And that's a huge thing. It's like asking consumer, you don't get better quality necessarily. You don't get better anything, but we want you to stay, pay more while you're here. It's like with a product. We want you to pay more for this toothpaste than the other toothpaste. It's very difficult to ask someone to do that. You have to have other reasons for it. And the other reasons are, supporting our country and all these other things. And so there are a lot of people that are doing it, but that's a really high mountain to climb when you're talking about international companies that are selling all over the world. And it bothers me. It bothers me that people are leaving, and it does make you feel like they're a traitor. However, it really makes sense.
Yeah, and it particularly because we allow companies to leave the country to move to markets where they are less regulated or even unregulated in some cases, where they're given very favorable conditions, where price of labor is a fraction of what it is here, where there's no organized labor, and where they're allowed to export products and services into the United States essentially without any punitive cost for it. So, if you're simply looking at a bottom line, if you're simply looking at the bottom line, it's almost understandable that this is happening. What is, I think, the message of the Tea Party movement, now also, I think, echoed by Trump's highly intriguing candidacy, is that this country needs to change in a way that incentivizes, encourages job creation and companies to remain in the United States. And we don't have anything close to a system like that right now. And it's a very, very big driving factor behind over 90 million Americans not in the formal labor force, not in the workforce. Essentially under Obama's, less than 1% GDP growth in the country, no economic expansion, and the country becoming less and less competitive in relation to its primary trading partners around the world. Our trade deficit's increasing with every major trading partner.
Well, let's think of it. The real intense socialist countries, communist countries, they all have a lower tax rate. It's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? But when you think about it from other tax standpoint too, right? I had someone on the show and they were talking about how we are actually higher taxed than most socialist countries, pretty much all of them. When you start to realize that we pay for our own health care, essentially, we pay for our own education. Yeah, there's public elementary education or, but post-second college, those kinds of things, we have to pay for our own. So you start adding all these things in that we have to pay for, and then how big our military is. You have to think that we do have a really large military that we pay for. We are taxed more than a lot of other countries just when you look at that as well, if you count what we have to pay on our own. The services that they don't provide.
I always say we're the highest tax corporate rate in the world. I think I remember seeing, Chad and maybe UAE had slightly higher rates, but consider how big this is. I mean, it's 39%. Okay, it's $4 out of $10 that a company makes between its 35% federal rate, and then if you average out the state rates, it's like essentially another 4%. That's going to government. And, and then I challenge this idea that this is something that Washington needs. I think that's another big myth that's been perpetuated, on, the voting public.
If they ran, I talk to people who are starting companies all day long or running companies, and a lot of these people really figure out how to run lean. It's hard to believe that the government needs the money that it needs.
They don't.
When you understand how to run lean and you understand how to do these things, and then you look at how the government runs, it's past laughable. It really is sad.
We also fail to distinguish, which I think is a very important distinction. I've written about this fairly extensively. I'm going to be writing a lot more about it, so I think it's so hugely important, between, say, a state or a municipal government that really ultimately does have to operate in balance because they don't control the currency, and a federal government like ours that is a fiat currency system, meaning it's not tied to any particular commodity. It's free-floating, and in a system that's been set up over the last few decades where the country can raise funds very easily with the issuance of treasury bonds, doesn't even need the demand for treasury bonds because we've allowed the government to repurchase our own treasury bonds under the quantitative easing and the other policies that are governing our treasury right now. So that becomes complex, I think, for a lot of Americans. It is, in fact, complex. So it's not. I'm not saying that in a disparaging way towards the American people.
Understood
but it's a very big. It's a huge distinction, and I would boil it down to say, why do we need federal tax? Like, what would happen tomorrow if we abolished every federal tax in the country, and the federal government had zero revenue? Well, it wouldn't be that we would have to, shut down our military or, kick someone's door in to pay someone else's Social Security benefits. The government has the full ability to do that. The risk is inflation, is that, when you're not taking money out of the economy and you're pouring it into it, you have inflationary pressures. But we're in an economy right now where clearly, we have essentially no inflation except in maybe some economic sectors, housing maybe particularly.
Well, when you talk about schooling, education, and healthcare, there's a lot of inflation there.
We have zero reason, which is, I think, a big part of our Tea Party message, zero reason and every reason to be cutting taxes. And I mean at all levels, including, like, for instance, in this minimum wage debate, I don't believe the minimum wage is a good idea, not because I don't want to see wages go up, I do, but because clearly it's proven over and over again to be a job-killing regulation.
See,
but if you really wanted to raise wages, if we were serious about that, why would we not eliminate the payroll tax right now, which any entry-level hourly worker is paying day one coming out of their paycheck? So their disposable income will increase immediately if we were able to get rid of this tax.
Well, it's almost like
and
you guys
why do
need
we
to
even
go,
have it?
well, you almost have to go on a campaign saying, let's raise wages, but this is how we're going to do it. So people, because when you vote against the, increasing wages, people just think you're awful. You're against poor people. No.
Yes.
That's not what we're doing. We want wages to be higher, but that's not how we want it, because that doesn't ultimately make wages higher. We want people to be more prosperous. We want people to thrive and make more money. But we know that doesn't work. But let's do these things, because then it will ultimately raise wages for most people, and will thrive.
Yeah,
they just.
So I think it's really
Go ahead.
Having, like, in one of the common denominators in almost every professional capacity that I've had, including the current one in the Tea Party movement, which is, the conveying and communicating of messages. I mean, I've done that in the White House. I've done it in corporate America. I've done it, in Senate level, in other, capacities, and I do that now in this grassroots movement, is I think the biggest deficiency right now in communicating conservative and Tea Party ideas is that we have the stigma still associated with us that we do not have an adequate amount of empathy or consideration for this country's poor. And then there could be nothing further from the truth.
Well,
I think we ultimately have the solutions to that. And I want to see that reversed. And that's, again, to come back to Trump, what's enthusiastic. One of the reasons I'm so enthusiastic about Trump is I think he's turning this traditional political paradigm on its head. Washington, D.C. conservatives, of which I used to be one and of which I still, maintain strong relationships, have been very ineffective in this. And there's just issues that should have been addressed that haven't been addressed. And they essentially have been all of these issues related to trade, wages, maintaining economic growth here, discouraging outsourcing, bad trade deals, badly negotiated trade deals, all of these things that don't really receive the level of attention that they should, that are so important to middle and lower income Americans.
They're so important. And I don't think people realize how much it's impacting them. And what happens is that the conversation turns into racism. You're racist, you're bigoted, you don't care about poor people. And then all these important issues you can't talk about because either they don't understand them or they've been sidelined because of this. You end up being sidelined.
Let's be clear about
Go ahead.
Let's be clear about what's going on. Let's be clear about what's going on with that. And this is the case with our fiscal policy agenda. It's been social conservatives have also been stigmatized in this way. Is that the left of this country, the far left of this country, has at a high level has been hugely successful in saying, what would happen if we basically stopped trying to win the policy argument over which was in the best interest of the country, and instead we could say there's our way of doing things, and then there's hate and discrimination.
Exactly.
That they could actually put that level of it, that they could attach those things that all of us have such objection to, want nothing to do with. I cringe when I hear that because honestly,
why can't I be fiscally conservative and not be a bigot and a racist? Because my husband's a Mexican, and I'm I have Hispanic children, and I love people of all types. I try to, but I'm fiscally conservative. That does not mean I'm racist. And so why can't there be a place? There needs to be a place for that. And it just doesn't
especially, I happened for the first time. I used to work a long time ago now with Dinesh D'Souza, who's turned into quite the extraordinary maker of conservative documentary films. And I happened to see the trailer for his forthcoming film, which I think is focused on the dangers of Hillary Clinton. And he tackles this geniusly, too, about how, really to the extent that there has been, which clearly there has been, racism and objection to inclusiveness in America's history, it has been almost universally perpetuated by Democrats and particularly liberal Democrats. So there's been this.
Isn't that odd? Because that's where
the objection to the objection to civil rights legislation was all on the left. The debate, even over slavery itself, was defended by
when did that turn?
The Democratic Party.
When did the right become associated with that?
I would say that it's certainly happened over the last few decades. I mean, it's been a constant.
I remember in the 80s
since my involvement, but it's been particularly true now because we've been in a political culture that, unfortunately, is so dumbed down in a lot of ways, and it's not the American people's fault. It's the way these ideas are presented to them that I think we've gotten a very kind of closed mindset. And unfortunately, a lot of people have bought into this argument, and as a result of it, they're not hearing out all of the available policy options that we could be pursuing. There's a further danger to that, too, is that, for instance, if you look at the traditional support that African Americans have had, for instance, with the Democratic Party. I mean, it's really not been in the interest of African Americans in any way. The obvious ways are, look at these, major crumbling cities that have been governed for decades by liberal Democrats. They've been universally destructive and failed. There's no one can look at it and go, well, those policies are working. They're failing in education. They're failing in crime. They're failing, in
I really believe that
morals, ethics, all that stuff. But then here's the other way that other people don't think about.
Yeah.
Is that once, as a presumed political constituency, once you are so clearly aligned with one political party, what happens? How do both parties respond to that? I mean, in the case of the Republican Party, sadly, they look at that and go, well, it's a lost constituency. They're not listening to us. We can't get that vote. So they stop paying attention to the interests, say, of African Americans. And then with the Democratic Party, they begin to take it for granted. They say, we've got that vote locked up. We don't really need to pay particular concern to the interests of Africa. And that's happening right now. That's happening right now.
And
if
the
you look
outcome of that,
at Democratic leadership, the Democratic leadership of this country, including the two presidential candidates, presume that the African American vote is going to them, and the issues affecting African Americans in this country, and I mean particularly those affecting urban communities, are not going to receive the level of creative policy thinking and attention that they urgently want. And we are losing generation after generation of children that are coming up in these communities, in these hopeless communities, where it's really nearly impossible to escape the circle of welfare dependency, of lost opportunity, lack of education, bad schools, crime, drugs, all of those associated things. That's not to say those don't exist everywhere in the country. They do increasingly. Unfortunately, they're not.
You guys need a campaign. The conservatives need a campaign that says, okay, we are going to end poverty and we're going to raise wages and we are going to end racism by doing these things. And show people this is not what it's about, and we are going to tackle these issues. And so people start to say, hey, these guys aren't racist and aren't bigoted and against the poor. No, we actually are for you guys, but this is these are the policies we think works to solve those problems. And we've just been labeled this unfairly and stereotyped unfairly. Granted, there are some racists and bigots and weirdos that claim to be conservative, and nobody wants them around, right? I mean, who wants that? But,
yeah, I'll be honest with you, though. So let's just say in this Tea Party movement, I mean, I've been in literally hundreds of conference calls, closed-door meetings, et cetera. I mean, if I had ever heard even one suggestion or mention of an idea that suggested that there was any degree of that thinking, I would move to either purge that person or people from the movement, or I would leave it completely. I would want zero affiliation with that. And I think when I say that, I think I speak for just about everyone. And the truth is, when you have like a movement of tens upon tens of millions of Americans, which we now have, and there's really no barrier to entry. I mean, nobody sits there and, gives you a multiple choice questionnaire, that you have to pass before you get into it. Anyone can essentially enter it. It really is not a predominant theme out there. And I think among those of us who lead, one of my closest colleagues in the Tea Party movement, a guy named Kevin Jackson, he's a Fox News contributor. He's very articulate, I think, in fighting the policies of the urban left and the issues that I just raised. And we talk exactly about what you just mentioned, about how do we make progress in letting all of these demographic communities that have somehow decided we're not on their side know that that's definitely not the case.
You come out with an agenda.
If we reverse that in.
You come out with an agenda. This is how we're gonna raise wages.
Yeah.
This is how we are.
Well, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. And I think you got to start with saying, let's get rid of this payroll tax. I mean, why should someone who's coming in at a $10 an hour job be having a payroll tax assessed on them with the first dollar that they make? I mean, that is just punitive beyond belief. And I just, like I said earlier, there's no fiscal need for us. There's no danger. This is something you never hear. This is something you never hear on the payroll tax.
Scared to do that because they think that if we don't pay taxes, then there's not going to be money to pay for services.
That's exactly wrong. So if you keep hearing, you heard even in the presidential race, like I think I heard Rubio say this wrongly. I think I heard Ted Cruz say this. He's wrong about it. That we're bankrupting the Medicare program, or we're bankrupting the Social Security program. That's the definition of a fiat system that we operate in, is that it can't by nature go bankrupt. You could have unregulated inflation. That's why we have a Federal Reserve. That's why we have an elected Congress that ostensibly is supposed to be governing fiscal policy in the country to avoid that. But the idea that somehow we would just wake up one day and the country would not have the money to meet its obligations is inconceivable, implausible, and impossible in the system that we have. Now, in other countries that don't have our system, it's very possible. And as I said, on a state and community level, absolutely. We've seen cities in this country go bankrupt, and that just happens when they have, say, municipal bond obligations that they've got to meet, and they don't have the revenue to meet it. There's really not a whole lot of options available to them, particularly once they have downgrades in their bonds and whatnot. You ultimately can be backed into the corner where literally a city or a state even, could be forced to declare bankruptcy. And I think you have California sort of and New York State as well to some extent. Yeah. New Jersey, where I am to some extent, at a point where their obligations, in the Medicaid program and in other areas are so extensive that there's just almost no fighting way out of it, because the only thing they can think really to do is to continue raising taxes, and every incremental tax increase just drives productive people out of their state, and that's what's been happening in New York State and California now for a long time.
Why can't you just come out and say these are our agendas instead of, so that people can stop the argument of the racism and the bigotry and the anti-poor? Wait. Why can't you just say, we're on a campaign to raise wages, but this is how. We are on a campaign to end racism, but this is how. We are in a campaign, you know what I'm saying? So that you come out and just say, this is what we're about. We're about, ending racism. We're about ending poverty. But these are our things for doing that, so that we can stop this, because we can't even talk about real issues anymore because. Oh yeah.
That's not a mistake. I mean, that's the design of the stigma is to shut down debate. Now, it doesn't shut down mainstream debate, but it shuts down, for instance, I want to be able, as a Tea Party conservative, I want to be able to go in and speak to, an urban, predominantly African-American church and explain to them why these ideas are in their best interest. And I want them to hear me, and I want to hear them, and I want to hear them. I want these to be forums that are at least open to us. And unfortunately, the leadership of these communities,
at least 50% of those people would be fiscally conservative or be more conservative in their views. And I would think there'd even be more that are, that want strong families and things like that. Now, I got to tell you, I'm open to all sorts of people. I don't care if someone's a homosexual or not. I really don't care. I don't think government has a place for mandating anything like that. But I don't think those are our most important issues in our country. I think the failure for our country to thrive, the failure of children being neglected by the millions and not thriving. Right. Those are our issues, and that takes loving care by whatever family you got.
You raise a good point there, because I think in a sense, the federal government has taken on so many responsibilities that go beyond its constitutionally defined powers and authorities, that it's so distracted with so many things that the core things that it should be doing, for instance, start with the national security of the country, which should start with a secure border. I mean, we're not having people that seek military destruction able to walk into our country, as they have been now for a few decades. You start with the security issues, defending the country,
but our military. Don't you think we're just not focused with our military? Because we spend so much money on military. We have bases everywhere, and yet we don't need to spend that. I don't think we need to spend that much money. But yeah, do we really, really need a strong defense? Yeah, we need to protect ourselves. I think,
and again, I come back again to sort of say, yay, Donald Trump, because I think when he put his messaging out about, kind of rethinking and NATO, that's like a really important message. And he was shut down, and I think, they sort of attempted to stigmatize him as being anti-NATO, which wasn't the case. But we're in a 21st century right now where we still have essentially a national security structure that was created during the Cold War, and that has been perpetuated into an era where that idea of mutual assured destruction and a Soviet Union that doesn't even exist any longer, aggressively seeking conquest in every continent of the world no longer exists. We're now in
it's a waste of money when we got issues to deal with. I mean, honestly.
Right. We now have two more very serious but confined threats in what Russia and China are doing in the way of
financial. It's financial.
Particular areas of regional aggression. And then the most and predominant threat I think everyone is aware of is, it started, really, before 9/11, but as everyone's aware of it now, is global terrorism, and that's Al Qaeda, it's ISIS, but it's also it's a whole network, a whole web of terrorist movements around the world, including in this country.
I can tell you're used to talking in these political forms. But as you know, terrorism starts, a lot of the terrorism because of our fiscal policies. And when desperate people are desperate, they do desperate things because a normal person isn't going to want to be a terrorist. Sure, you got nut jobs, and nut jobs are nut jobs are everywhere, and there's not much we can do about that. But the normal person isn't going to join a terrorist group unless they're desperate. And that's the problem.
There's no doubt that economic growth generally is helpful, but that's not in and of itself the solution. I mean, you've clearly got a lot of very well-off Saudis that have been financing, the terror movement now for a long time. I mean,
but to get to get the people to join and actually fight it, they're not going to join and actually fight it unless they're not thriving. Yeah, so we got nut job people who have a lot of money too. That's a problem.
Yeah.
But
look, this is a conflict of civilizations, of way of life, of
that's true. Yep,
varying values, and I believe there's going to be a winner and loser. I mean, this is not going to end with some sort of balance of power structure. I mean, I believe we need a complete obliteration of ISIS. I think the country believes that as well. They've seen enough of it to know. I think that's fully within our ability to do it. But again, to come back to what we're saying is, you need both a security structure, a national security policy, and then you need the political will to say this is in the American interest to go do that. And everything that we do should ultimately be in the American interest. So again, like it's Trump raising, should we be paying for the defense of Europe and Japan? Well, clearly we want Europe and Japan defended. But also clearly, the structure of this whole system was set up in an era of time that has come and gone. And those are now huge powers.
A lot of those countries should be paying for their own police force. I mean, we just don't have the money to be paying for that, right? We have to be so much smarter in how we go about doing this. I also think that we shouldn't fuel the flames as far as creating desperate people. So we should be doing smart things that way. It's a whole big picture of just being a heck of a lot smarter in how we do things.
Yeah, I mean, in the ideal world, where, essentially all nations were peaceful and wedded to basic humanitarian democratic values, there'd be no need for the U.S. to be engaged really anywhere outside of its own domain. And so I do agree kind of with that libertarian concept that in the ideal world, you want us to be as less engaged in these areas as we have to. However, the circumstances that have developed, particularly since World War II, through the Cold War, and even now, have mandated our engagement in most of these areas. But even if you were going to look, say, like, has U.S. foreign aid worked? Have we actually developed economies with this aid? There are some success stories to be sure, but mostly it's failed. I mean, mostly the policies that we've pursued, ostensibly designed to be helpful, have been hurtful. I'll give you one example. I mean, I was for many years in Africa policy expert at the Heritage Foundation, and I was very involved with the Ethiopia policy. And I was very involved with the Ethiopia policy during some of their worst famines. One of the biggest unknown, unspoken realities of Ethiopia was that U.S. foreign aid into Ethiopia, which actually took the form of essentially handing out food, all right, which was done through the UN, through the United States AID and other global organizations. When you think about how that actually worked, on the short-term basis, yeah, it really did help alleviate hunger. Very importantly and helpfully, it did that. But the few existing for-profit agricultural entities that existed in Ethiopia that were ultimately the long-term solution to Ethiopia's problems were essentially, like, many of them put out of business completely. You know, so like, how do you sell a product when you've got ostensibly your ally coming in with unlimited resources, giving it away for free?
You can't. It undermined their whole infrastructure.
Yeah, and so I'm not trying to oversimplify it and say that we shouldn't have done what we did, but like I do believe that there have been many, many examples of U.S. involvement that were done in ways that, you know, made sense on a bumper sticker, but when you really drill down to what the policy reality of the outcomes were and the effect that it actually was having was negative. And it's hugely unfortunate because I've been all over the world, and this country is still held in very high esteem. But, you know, I think particularly one of the great failures of this Obama administration has been that we are less and less held in high esteem. I mean, increasingly we're viewed as not particularly any different than anybody else. We're perceived to not really stand by our friends or fight our enemies. And once you get that kind of reputation on the street, it is not a disincentive to aggression. It's an incentive to aggression. Because now all of a sudden, will the U.S. stand by its allies? Well, I don't know. They, you know, draw lines in the sand and then don't stand by them. They, you know, say they're going to defend allies and then don't. They have all this verbally articulated opposition to certain policies and aggressions in the world, and then do nothing about it. In fact, actually, even in some ways, end up collaborating in some ways with it. You know, we just send all of these very contradictory messages, and if you're sitting there, it becomes less and less, and trying to decide, you know, like what to do in real conflict areas. It becomes more and more dangerous to align yourself with the United States because we are not, at this day and age, a country that can be relied upon.
That's
stand by its word, do the right thing.
Always do the right. Stand by what you say. Have integrity. Be honest. You have to. It's just like a relationship with another person. You have to.
So I mean, you can't say enough. Like, just to take Obama's red line in Syria, which, you know, I mean, he was very clear that you know, this was basically what would not be tolerated, and then of course did nothing, you know, in a way of following up or holding his word to it. That may see, on the surface, if you're not really thinking about it, you might say, well, you know, it's Syria policy, and yeah, it's important, but it's just like one country. That is the whole world. Decision makers, heads of state, foreign ministers, terrorist movements are looking at what this country is doing, and they see that, and they see the message that this country is not really at this juncture we don't stand by our word. And once that becomes your image and reputation out there, you start to notice that those people that are on the fence, you know, not sure which way to go, and they've got ISIS on the street telling them they've got to do things one way, and all they've got are words from the United States.
Oh, yeah.
They don't want to fight this. They don't want to fight a system. And in many respects, I think, in many respects, what's happened in Iraq. I mean, I think, like, there were a lot of military headways made. Whatever you think of our engagement there, and I think in retrospect, maybe it was the wrong thing to do. But whatever you think of the engagement against Saddam Hussein, what's happened over the last, in this administration, has been that the people of Iraq and the army of Iraq has become less and less confident in the United States.
Well, and that also had to do with how we dealt with Iraq after Saddam Hussein toppled. I mean, we were awful at it. I mean, we had interns running things, and I mean, it was
in many ways one of the biggest arguments. Even before this, I mean, you know, regime change is a really serious thing.
Yes.
And if you look, you know, we've done it successfully a few places. Like I would cite the Philippines with Marcos, where it was done peacefully and ultimately in the interest of, but it was done in a thoughtful way. Like there was a clear idea of what was going to happen afterwards. If you look, where has it been done?
Bringing people that understand.
Where has it been done?
Go ahead.
Yeah, if you were going to say where's it been done unsuccessfully, let me just give you two examples. Like if you looked at the Iranian Revolution in 1979, I mean, the Carter administration cut off its military aid to the Shah because of its objection over some human rights issues. But they had no real long-term idea of what was going to come after the Shah fell. So the Shah falls, all right, and you have the Ayatollah and Iran emerge into power. Not only do human rights not improve, they get worse. And we got, as opposed to a human rights,
we were doing.
Yeah, we had a human rights abusing ally. Now we've got a human rights abusing enemy. In many respects, that's exactly what happened in Nicaragua as well, if you really want to look. I mean, Somoza in the late 70s was an undeniable abuser of human rights, but he was also an undeniable ally of the United States of America. The Carter administration was, very irritated at the rights violations in Nicaragua, but didn't look much deeper than that. Undermined the Somoza government, and Soviets, Cubans saw an opportunity in Nicaragua and thus emerged the Sandinista regime, which, just like was the case in Iran, ended up becoming just as bad, if not worse, in human rights, and then aligned with our enemies. And then when, of course, we found ourselves in the Contra War and the Reagan Doctrine generally, fighting governments that shouldn't have existed in the first.
We created a mess. But see, I think we created a mess with Iraq, too, because we didn't manage it right afterwards. People were, I think, pretty much more with us until the management afterwards. We did such a horse crap job of managing that situation that it turned into what we have today. I really think it created a lot of problems.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be overly critical because, I mean, you're looking at a decision that they made without clear understanding of what was going to come next. But I guess that's ultimately my point.
They were putting people in place that had no business running certain things. They did not have the experience, didn't have the...
Well, it's just because it's almost an impossible task.
Yeah, but they put people who just came out of college and stuff in important people have never even done, like people head of transportation, unless I got bad information. That's my understanding. It was just not, we were really good at taking down Saddam. We have a really good military program. And then it was a joke on how we ran. I mean, the fact that we allowed all their museums to be looted and, just things that were precious to them, to that society, we allowed that to be looted. And so they lost some of their most precious items. It's just not, we just weren't very smart. You have to protect.
It's also just it's a hugely complex country that, in many respects, was almost miraculously kept together by Saddam. He did it brutally, obviously, but there was every reason for Iraq to have split apart under his regime, and every good reason once you didn't have a central head of state for the emergence of what we've had, which
you
is
needed
a real internal.
You needed a brutal dictator like him to keep it together. Not that.
Yeah, I don't want to go that further because I guess that's where I was going, saying that if there is hypothetically a scenario where, which I think a lot of people were hoping for in 2003, that you could have deposed Saddam and potentially seen the emergence of a U.S. aligned democracy emerge in the Middle East. And had that happened, and if you recall back then there was a lot of discussion about that possibility, the idea was that would be a revolution without frontiers, that ultimately if democratic
based on the
if that took root in Iraq, it would only be a matter of time until Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, ultimately
it would have been amazing.
Influenced.
But don't you think that was naive based on the situation?
Yes. In retrospect, I don't think there's any doubt that it was unduly optimistic thinking.
You say it in a much more politically correct way. It was pretty naive.
Well, no, but I think ultimately, if you look back on it now, like if you want to say, well, what are the lessons of Iraq? The lessons are that even if you enter into conflict attempting to be a force for good, that you have zero guarantee of the outcome of these conflicts. And the conclusion that you have to reach from that is that we need to be very sparing about our military engagement in the world. I don't believe that we should ever engage militarily unless there is a distinct, identifiable, understandable threat to United States interests, and then that the American people understand that. I mean, one of the greatest obligations of a president of the United States, in my judgment, is to explain to the American people when military force is potentially needed, why a lack of engagement is not an option. You know, so if you look, like, when we've had really significant failures, I would say, like, start with the Vietnam engagement, where, you know, the argument was really never made early on by the Kennedy administration, when it first began, about why this was important to do. And the American people never bought into the conflict. The popular support never existed for it. And you almost have guaranteed at that juncture, you know, a less than positive outcome. And then this happened in Iraq as well, is that, you know, I think everyone was led to believe that this engagement would be quick, that casualties would be minimal, and that the outcome would be undeniably comparatively better than it was, and that we were, and then of course, so we were taking a stand on Saddam as well, who, whether he did or did not have so-called weapons of mass destruction, which I would say chemical weapons, which he did have, are weapons of mass destruction, but whether he did or did not, you know, we found ourselves boxed in when he started violating these agreements that he'd made with the UN and others as it related to.
But that should have been communicated instead of weapons of mass destruction, because then what happened?
You got to think through. You got to think through it all. I mean, and you got to think through it right now, even right now, which is kind of like.
But people look back at that and think that the government just lied to us, right? Because it wasn't there, and so that's the problem.
My point is that we're facing these same questions right now, and we're not asking them, therefore we're not answering them. So, for instance, under the NATO agreements that we've entered into, any attack on any NATO member is deemed an attack on the United States, all right? Things have evolved completely. Are we now going to go to war with unlimited casualties to defend, you know, one of the Baltic states, for instance? You know, and maybe we should.
With the way
but I'm just saying, maybe that should be U.S. policy, that, you know, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are so vitally important that there will be no limit to our engagement to defend those countries. But let's at least understand that under the current structure, that is the commitment that we're making. If that's not if we don't believe that any longer, you know, if now it's like, well, no, maybe this is more of a shared obligation. Or that maybe the circumstances of it all would matter.
Reality, right?
Yeah, the policy needs to be realistic, and it has to evolve.
We have to have integrity. We have to do what we say we're going to do, and if we're not going to do what that agreement says, then you got to change the agreement.
We should be, you know, when it comes to friends, no greater friend in the world than the United States, and when it comes to, you know, crossing the United States and really doing those things that are definably against United States interests, no greater enemy. And I think that's the reputation that we want in the world, is that, you know, we want, and this has been articulated well by many presidents historically, we want peace with all, we'll work for peace with all. And if that becomes impossible and U.S. interests are significantly threatened, we will engage and we will prevail. And that's not a hope, that's a promise. It has to be that harshly and seriously.
So people don't mess with us.
In this global culture, it has to be understood that way.
Yes.
And that's unfortunately, if you look at what happened in Iraq, I mean, the surge was very successful, but, you know, really, as the KIAs added up, you know, in Iraq, I think literally with each one, U.S. support for our involvement there diminished.
Yes.
Because it was not clear really to most Americans what it was
that we were doing. We
were fighting and dying for.
People really didn't know.
And I'm not saying that by way of saying that it was that. I'm not saying that by way of saying our involvement was a great thing or a bad thing. I'm only saying that if you're going to engage at that level and you're going to sustain fatalities of young Americans, your biggest obligation is to communicate to the American people exactly why this is so vital, what the outcome of the alternative of inaction would be, and why that's unacceptable. And you got to prepare. I wrote a piece in the Christian Science Monitor in the 90s about some of the lessons of this when we were engaged with Serbia in the Bosnia conflict. You got to prepare the country for the fact that even if we do really well, that there's going to be casualties and there's going to be costs. And that's a very, very difficult case to make. And to your point of maybe us being a little too engaged in militarily in the world, it should be a difficult threshold to me.
It should be.
We shouldn't be ever, trivially engaged or a little bit involved. I mean, you could take the Somalia and U.S. engagement in Somalia, for instance. Lots of examples of this where, it's like, well, what's the interest exactly that we're fighting for?
Doing?
Why are we're minimally committing each other? And also, I would go to this point of coalitions of the willing or alliances. Look, sometimes in this world, the United States has to act alone. All right. And that's also got to be clear, is that we want our allies with us. We'll do everything to make sure our allies are with us. We'll request their involvement. We'll incentivize their involvement. But ultimately, if U.S. interests are threatened and our European and other allies are not prepared to be with us,
then we have to be prepared. Well, you have to protect ourselves.
We have to act alone, and we got to get rid of this facade that somehow there has to be some universal consensus.
Well, it's like relating to your child.
We're permitted.
This is something
we're permitted to defend our rights, to defend our interests.
Well, this is something everybody can understand. If something is happening to your child, just because the other people, the neighbors or whatever, aren't involved, you have to act upon. Even if no one else is being affected, you still have to protect your own child, and that's the same thing with your country, right? Everybody understands.
That's absolutely it. And then and then you want your child to know that, everything that you will do, and you want your child to know that you'll be there for them. You don't want there to be any doubt in their minds. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
It's a psychological process. I'm sure it's true in a marriage as well. I mean,
exactly.
Which
it's the same concept.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be able to present almost without even always having to articulate it, the fact that you're reliable, your
integrity,
that you will operate in with a understood objectives in mind. And if you fail to do that, you've already set up a culture for failure.
Yes. Before we wrap this up here, I have one more question that I want to ask you around the Federal Reserve, because we haven't really talked about that, and I really want to hear what your thoughts are. What do you think about the Federal Reserve? Should it be audited or should it be replaced? What are you thinking about that?
There's no reason not to audit the Federal Reserve, and the only real opponents to that audit are the Federal Reserve, and one of their
they're strong though because it never happened.
One of their objections, I believe, is that if you look at the congressional testimony that given by the Fed by say the chair now Yellen, when Yellen goes up and talks to Congress, it's like two people talking over each other's heads. Congress does not understand the Federal Reserve at all. They do not understand it.
I would think that's true.
And by the way, even that would be okay. We don't need a Congress that understands everything as long as they understand that they don't understand everything. So, if you're like, we don't understand this, but we are going to endeavor to understand it, that's okay. But if you think you understand it and you don't even understand the most basic fundamentals of it, and then you've got someone like Janet Yellen who's going to come up who's intimately involved on a daily basis on the complexities that they don't understand, they're talking over each other's heads. And I believe that's been going on for decades. And so the Federal Reserve has become this hugely misunderstood, stigmatized institution. It should be audited, but
we have
it also
to audit
needs to be.
Because let's face it, if you can't,
the Fed also needs to communicate better. They've got to be able to also, just inconsistent with what I was saying with national security and foreign policy, the American people should understand, about our central banking system and how it functions.
How can any business person that runs a company of any size not be just completely annoyed with the fact that we don't know what's going on with our own money? I can't even understand how that's not obvious. Go ahead.
One of the biggest lessons I drew from over a decade in Washington D.C. in both policy circles and in government is that that when you come up into public policy, you're very well educated on fiscal policy. So like within DC political culture, there's a pretty good understanding of tax policy and spending. There's very, very limited understanding of monetary policy. So if you get into, say, interbank lending or repurchase agreements or, the Fed funds rate or term auctions, interest on reserves, or deposit facilities, any of this stuff is, even to like economists, is an alien language.
Yep, that makes sense.
And so I think we need a much broader degree of understanding of how this system actually functions.
Because to not audit
it doesn't mean that we should audit it. Yeah, absolutely. It's entirely reasonable, but you should also understand. Yeah, but you also understand when you audit the Federal Reserve, it's not like auditing the finances of a 7-Eleven. I mean, there's particular structure of the Fed.
But to not audit is lunacy.
Well, and I'm only saying that by way of trying to offer some admittedly tepid defense.
No, but that was great defense. That helps.
No, but of the Fed, I don't think their objection is that I don't think their objection is that they're concealing something. I don't think they're concealing anything. But I do believe they're afraid that this audit is going to be done as much as congressional inquiry has been done by people that don't understand monetary policy and are going to reach dangerously bad conclusions or frighten the American people. Ultimately, the entire world has confidence in the United States dollar, and they have to have confidence in it.
That makes sense.
That has to be sustained.
But it still has to be. I mean, you can't. Like any business, you can't have an organization that's so important just running on their own. It just doesn't. No. It's just lunacy. There has to be a solution for that.
But also, I think the independence of the Fed is important, and I do believe
there has to be a solution of some sort, though, because I mean, you can't just have.
Yeah, I think you've got to have Congress more involved. Auditing is only one of the levels of involvement. You have Congress more involved, but not just aimlessly involved. They're going to be involved in an educated way.
Yes,
and it should be. The Fed should be more transparent. But again, what's the fear of transparency? The fear is, well, the American people don't understand the basic fundamentals. No one's explaining this. They're going to reach dangerously bad conclusions, and we're going to have a crash of the dollar. I mean, things like this happen in marketplaces, including in our own equity marketplaces all the time, where a misunderstanding leads to bad conclusions and money flows in bad ways.
Which is fine, but we can't have that be an excuse for letting a rogue organization do whatever they want. You can't create that. Yeah. But hey, you know what? This has been an absolutely awesome conversation. I really enjoyed it today. And
anytime. Thank you.
I got to have you back at some point, before the election's over, if you don't mind, and we could talk about it.
Absolutely.
Okay,
happy to do it.
Okay, great. Michael, thank you. Have a great day.
So I hope you enjoyed that full interview with Michael Johns. And if you have any suggestions for any shows you think we should do or any topics, please send me an email. My email's up on my website at sarahwestall.com. And I'm always looking for ideas. We're looking for the edge of change, disruption, big issues. And so if you see anything that's really affecting society, technology, science, I'm interested. I want to know what you think, especially if you have a contact for me. So for now, I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
You've been listening to Business Game Changers with host Sarah Westall. Tune in each Monday at noon Pacific, 3 Eastern, as Sarah brings you leading experts, visionaries, and newsmakers who provide the best commentary on big issues and cutting-edge innovations. Sarah's 20 years as a business executive will help you think like an entrepreneur with expertise, energy, and attitude. Tune in Mondays at 12 noon Pacific Time and learn more about Sarah at sarahwestall.com today.